The moment Ethan Walker walked into that courtroom, half the people in the room had already decided he was going to lose. You could see it in their faces. Some of them didn't even bother hiding it. A few city officials sat near the front whispering to each other, and every now and then one of them would glance back toward Ethan and smirk. He was still wearing his station jacket, the dark navy one with faded reflective stripes and soot stains that never seemed to come out no matter how many times it went through the wash. It wasn't a statement. It was simply the only jacket he grabbed on his way out the door that morning. But somehow that made him look even more out of place among the polished suits and expensive briefcases. One reporter leaned toward another and quietly asked, "That's him?" The other nodded. "Yeah, the firefighter." There was something about the way she said it that made it sound small. Like being a firefighter was somehow less important than being a lawyer or a councilman. Ethan noticed the looks, but after 23 years on the job, he had learned something important. People who spend their lives sitting behind desks often have very strong opinions about dangers they've never actually faced. So he kept walking. Calm. Quiet. The same way he'd walked into burning buildings for most of his adult life. What nobody in that courtroom knew was that 6 months earlier, Ethan had been one of the most respected firefighters in Pine Ridge County. Not famous. Not decorated with national awards. Just respected. The kind of guy younger firefighters called when they needed advice. The kind of guy who volunteered for extra shifts when someone else's kid got sick. The kind of guy who remembered everyone's birthday, but somehow forgot his own. He wasn't perfect. He could be stubborn as hell. His ex-wife used to joke that Ethan would argue with a stop sign if he thought it was wrong. But nobody ever questioned his heart. Nobody ever questioned his commitment. Then came the warehouse fire. Looking back now, Ethan sometimes wondered if his life had really changed that night, or if the fire simply exposed people for who they had always been. It started just after midnight. He had been halfway through a stale cup of station coffee when the alarm sounded. The call came in as a structure fire on the industrial side of town, an older manufacturing warehouse near the railroad tracks. At first nobody thought it would be anything unusual. Fires happened. That was the job. But as Engine 7 pulled onto Jefferson Industrial Road, Ethan immediately knew this one was different. Flames were already shooting through sections of the roof. Thick black smoke rolled into the night sky like a storm cloud. Even from 2 blocks away, they could feel the heat through the windshield. "Damn," one of the rookies muttered from the back seat. Nobody disagreed. The scene was chaos before they even arrived. Workers were running through the parking lot. Someone was screaming. Another man was on his knees crying into his hands. Ethan jumped from the truck and immediately started gathering information. That's when he heard the words that changed everything. 2 guys are still inside. The worker who said it was shaking so hard he could barely speak. 2nd floor fabrication area. They never made it out. Ethan looked toward the building, then toward the arriving crews, then back toward the warehouse. Every second mattered. Protocol existed for a reason. Firefighters understood that better than anyone. Procedures saved lives. Structure. Discipline. Chain of command. But protocol also assumes you have time. Sometimes you don't. Through the roar of the fire, Ethan thought he heard something. Faint. Barely there. A scream. Maybe. Maybe not. He couldn't even tell for sure. But once the possibility entered his mind, he couldn't ignore it. His lieutenant grabbed his arm. "Walker, hold up. Backup's still 2 minutes out." Ethan stared at the flames. 2 minutes. That sounded short when you were sitting safely in a conference room. It felt very different when someone might be trapped inside a collapsing building. "If they're alive now," Ethan said quietly, "they won't be in 2 minutes." His lieutenant knew exactly what he meant. Neither man said another word. Ethan adjusted his mask, checked his air supply, and stepped toward the entrance. Behind him someone shouted his name. Ahead of him was fire. And without knowing that his entire future was about to change, Ethan disappeared into the smoke. The second Ethan crossed the threshold, the world outside disappeared. The screaming workers, the flashing emergency lights, the radio chatter from arriving crews, all of it faded behind a wall of smoke and heat. Inside, everything narrowed down to a few feet of visibility and the sound of his own breathing through the mask. The warehouse was older than most people realized, built decades earlier and modified so many times that the floor plans barely matched reality anymore. Storage racks stood like giant shadows in the darkness. Sparks drifted through the air. Somewhere overhead, metal groaned in a way that made every firefighter instantly uneasy. Ethan moved forward anyway. He followed the direction where workers said the fabrication area was located, staying low, feeling walls and equipment with his gloved hands whenever visibility disappeared completely. Then he heard it again. A voice. Weak this time. Human. Definitely human. Help. Ethan changed direction immediately. A few moments later he found the first man. The worker was trapped beneath a section of fallen shelving, conscious but barely. Ethan dropped beside him. Hey, stay with me. I'm getting you out. The man tried to respond but started coughing violently. Ethan managed to free him, pull him onto his shoulder, and begin the long trip back toward the stairs. Every step felt heavier than the last. The heat kept building. The smoke thickened. Twice he lost orientation and had to stop to find his bearings again. When he finally emerged from the building carrying the injured worker, paramedics rushed forward. One firefighter grabbed Ethan's shoulder. You got one. Let's go. Ethan looked back toward the entrance. Something inside him refused to move. There's another one. Walker, no. There's another one. Before anyone could stop him, he turned and headed back inside. Later, people would argue about whether that decision was reckless. Some called it heroic. Some called it irresponsible. Ethan never saw it either way. In his mind, there was only one question. If your brother was trapped in there, would you go back? For him, the answer had always been yes. The second search was worse. Much worse. Part of the ceiling had already started collapsing. Flames now stretched across areas that had been passable only minutes earlier. His radio crackled with orders to pull back. He heard them. He simply couldn't obey them yet. Then he found the second worker. The man was pinned behind welding equipment, barely conscious and struggling to breathe. Ethan later learned his name was Miguel Ramirez, a father of 2 daughters. At the time, he was just another human being who needed help. Ethan worked desperately to free him. Every second felt borrowed. Every sound from the building made him wonder if the next collapse would be the one that trapped them both forever. When the equipment finally shifted enough to create space, Ethan pulled Miguel free and practically dragged him toward the exit. Halfway there, a deafening crack echoed overhead. A support beam failed somewhere above them. Ethan remembered looking up and seeing what felt like the entire building moving. Instinct took over. He shoved Miguel ahead of him and pushed forward with everything he had left. They burst through the entrance moments before part of the second floor collapsed behind them. The shockwave knocked several firefighters backward. The noise alone silenced the entire scene. For a moment, nobody moved. Then someone shouted, "They're out." The parking lot erupted. Paramedics rushed in. Firefighters surrounded Ethan. Somebody slapped his helmet. Somebody else laughed from pure relief. One of the rookies later admitted he had tears in his eyes. They all thought they had witnessed something extraordinary. So did Ethan. But not because of what he had done. Because 2 men were still alive. That's all that mattered. At least, that's what he believed. For a few days, it seemed everyone else agreed. Local news stations called him a hero. The rescued workers' families thanked him. People stopped him at grocery stores. Children asked for pictures. Ethan hated the attention, but he tolerated it because the story wasn't really about him. Then the city administration got involved. It started quietly. A request for reports. Internal reviews. Formal interviews. Nothing unusual. At first, Ethan wasn't worried. He answered every question honestly. He explained exactly what happened. Then the tone changed. During one interview, a city investigator leaned back in his chair and asked, "Did you receive instructions to wait for backup?" Ethan nodded. "Technically, yes. And yet you entered the structure anyway." Ethan stared at him. There were people inside. The investigator wrote something down. No reaction. No acknowledgement. Just writing. That's when Ethan felt the first knot form in his stomach. Weeks later, the city announced its findings. According to the official report, Ethan had violated operational procedures. According to city attorneys, his actions created unnecessary risk. According to administrators who had never entered a burning building in their lives, he had endangered himself, his crew, and the department. Then came the punch nobody saw coming. They terminated him. 23 years of service erased with a single vote. Worse, they initiated proceedings that threatened portions of his retirement benefits. The city manager stood before cameras and spoke about accountability. Council members talked about maintaining standards. One councilman actually said, "No individual is above protocol." Ethan watched that press conference from his living room and felt something inside him break. Not because he lost the job. Firefighters understand risk. Careers end. Bodies were down. Life changes. What crushed him was hearing people rewrite reality. Two men were alive. Everyone knew why they were alive. Yet somehow the conversation had shifted from lives saved to rules broken. Friends stopped by his house. Some offered support. Others offered advice. Just settle. Move on. You can't beat City Hall. Maybe they meant well. Maybe they were trying to protect him. But every time someone suggested surrendering, Ethan remembered the families of those two workers. He remembered hearing Miguel's daughters laughing during a hospital visit weeks after the rescue. He remembered realizing those girls still had a father because somebody chose action over caution. One evening, his former colleague Ryan Mercer showed up carrying a cardboard box. Ryan set it on the kitchen table. "What's this?" Ethan asked. Ryan smiled. Something the city forgot existed. Inside were copies of body camera recordings from firefighters who had been on scene. Ethan stared at the footage. Then Ryan pulled out something else. Witness statements. Internal communications. Preliminary reports. The deeper they looked, the stranger things became. Certain documents referenced recommendations praising Ethan's judgment. Yet those recommendations never appeared in the final city file. A fire marshal's assessment highlighted the fact that both victims would likely have died without immediate intervention. Somehow that assessment had vanished from the official narrative too. Ethan looked at Ryan. "You telling me they buried this?" Ryan shrugged slowly. "I'm telling you somebody didn't want it seen." For the first time since losing his job, anger replaced disappointment. Not blind anger. Focused anger. The kind that gives a person direction. Because now this wasn't just about getting his badge back. It wasn't even about his pension. It was about truth. And if city leaders were willing to sacrifice that truth to protect themselves from political embarrassment, then maybe someone needed to force it back into the light. So Ethan made a decision. He wasn't going to disappear quietly. He wasn't going to accept being labeled reckless by people who had never faced the choice he faced. He filed suit against the city. The newspapers mocked his chances. Comment sections were brutal. City attorneys acted almost amused. One anonymous official even told a reporter, "This should be resolved quickly." Looking back, Ethan often laughed at that quote. Because the people who said it had no idea what was waiting for them inside Judge Eleanor Prescott's courtroom on the morning that would change everything. By the time the hearing finally arrived, the city looked completely relaxed. Their legal team entered the courtroom carrying thick binders and polished confidence. Ethan arrived alone. No expensive attorney. No media consultant. No public relations campaign. Just a former firefighter carrying a folder and wearing the same station jacket he had worn for years. From across the room, he could hear bits of conversation. One city official whispered, "This will be over before lunch." Another laughed quietly. Ethan heard it, but strangely, it no longer bothered him. Somewhere during the previous 6 months, fear had burned itself out. All that remained was certainty. He knew what happened that night. He knew who was alive because of it. And he knew the truth had a way of surviving longer than politics. The city's lead attorney wasted no time. He stood and painted Ethan as a well-meaning employee who had ignored procedures and endangered everyone around him. "Good intentions," he said confidently, "do not excuse reckless conduct." Then he looked directly at Ethan. Mr. Walker chose to act outside established protocol. The attorney sat down looking satisfied. For a moment the room was quiet. Then Judge Prescott adjusted her glasses and opened the evidence file. "That's interesting," she said calmly. "Because the evidence before this court tells a very different story." The attorney's expression changed immediately. The judge began reviewing document after document. Body camera footage showing conditions inside the warehouse. Testimony from firefighters who witnessed the rescue. Statements from safety experts. Then she held up a report. "Can someone explain why this fire marshal assessment praising Mr. Walker's actions was omitted from the city's primary filing?" Nobody answered. The silence itself became an answer. The judge continued. "According to this report, both trapped workers faced near-certain fatality if immediate rescue efforts had not occurred." She turned another page. "And according to these witness statements, Mr. Walker's actions directly prevented those fatalities." Suddenly the confidence that had filled the city's side of the courtroom began evaporating. Then came the moment Ethan would remember for the rest of his life. Judge Prescott looked directly at him. "Mr. Walker, Why did you go back inside? The courtroom became completely still. Ethan stood slowly. He hadn't rehearsed a speech. He didn't want one. Honestly, Your Honor, he began. Because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. He paused. I heard there were people trapped in that building. I knew the risks. I knew the rules. But I also knew that if those men died while I stood outside waiting, I'd think about it every day for the rest of my life. Maybe I made the hardest choice. Maybe I made the dangerous choice. But I made the choice I believed was right. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Even the reporters stopped typing. Ethan took a breath and continued. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was trying to bring two fathers home. For several seconds, the room remained silent. Then Judge Prescott nodded. And that, she said firmly, is exactly what you did. Her ruling wasn't long, but every word landed like thunder. The court found the city liable for wrongful termination. The court ordered Ethan's immediate reinstatement. His pension benefits would be fully restored. His lost wages would be repaid. The defamatory findings against him would be removed from his employment record. Then the judge delivered one final statement that nobody expected. She looked toward the city officials seated together and said, Public servants who evaluate the actions of firefighters should understand the realities those firefighters face. Therefore, I strongly recommend that members of the City Council participate in operational ride-alongs and field observations before making future judgments regarding emergency response decisions. Gasps spread across the courtroom. One reporter actually dropped his pen. The city attorney stared at his table. The smirks were gone. The whispers were gone. All that remained was reality. As people began filing out, Ethan gathered his documents and prepared to leave. Then he heard someone call his name. He turned and saw a man approaching through the crowd. It took him a second to recognize him. Miguel Ramirez, the worker from behind the welding station, the man he had dragged out of the warehouse. Miguel's eyes were already filling with tears before he reached him. You probably don't remember me, he said. Ethan smiled immediately. Of course I do. Miguel laughed softly and wiped his eyes. My youngest daughter turned 6 last month. His voice cracked. I gotta be there for her birthday, because of you. Neither man spoke for a moment. Sometimes there isn't anything left to say. Then Miguel reached into his wallet and pulled out a small, folded photograph. It showed 2 little girls standing beside a birthday cake. He handed it to Ethan. They know your name, he said quietly. Every year they will. Ethan looked at the picture and felt more emotional than he had during the entire trial. Not because he had won. Not because his job was coming back. But because in that moment, everything became simple again. Beyond the politics. Beyond the lawsuits. Beyond the headlines. 2 children still had their father. That was the whole story. Everything else was noise. A few weeks later, Ethan returned to Station 12. There was no grand ceremony. No marching band. No dramatic speech. Just firefighters waiting outside the bay doors when he arrived. Someone handed him a cup of terrible station coffee. Another firefighter slapped him on the shoulder and said, "About time you got back." Everyone laughed. And somehow that meant more than any courtroom victory ever could. But here's the question that still sparks arguments whenever people hear this story. Did Ethan do the right thing by breaking protocol to save those men? Or should rules always come first, even when lives are on the line? That's a debate people still have today. I'd love to hear what you think. Was the city protecting safety standards, or protecting itself from embarrassment after the fact? Leave your opinion in the comments below. And if you believe courage, responsibility, and common sense still matter in today's world, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who understands that sometimes doing the right thing comes with a price long before it comes with a reward.